I'm going to try to cover a lot in a little bit amount of time, and if I don't get it all, forgive me. I will happily make my slides and notes available. I can give them to Greg later on to email if you guys want them. But Julius, you did a great job, so I don't think I need to reread the scripture. You did it with feeling and oomph that I don't think I can provide today. So I'm going to jump right into our topic, but let me just say, I'm going to do this a bit from a personal point of view, and you might wonder, what has C.S. Lewis to do with discipleship? The C.S. Lewis Institute is a discipleship ministry. The goal of our founders, two men founded us back in the mid-'70s, one of whom was friends with Lewis, and said the goal, the mission of the Institute is not to make more fans of Lewis, to make more people like him, people who in heart and mind will live out their faith and point others to Jesus Christ. So that's our mission. We just have updated that imagery where Paul said, imitate me as I imitate Christ. We've maybe updated that a little bit to the modern day where it might look a little bit like Lewis. So that's where we come from. But a man who used to be the president of the C.S. Lewis Institute, Tom Tarrant, said this. He said, it's no secret that the church is suffering, whether it's called nominalism, whether it's nominalism, casual Christianity, easy believism, or even moralistic therapeutic deism, if you might have heard that term. It's clear that Dr. Tom Tarrant is right at the end of his quote here. He says, the lives of most professing Christians are not much different than their non-believing neighbors. Further, David Platt, a few years ago, in his book, Radical, talked about how we tend, instead of adopting a biblical worldview, we tend to share the same basic presuppositions as non-believers and embrace ideas that values, as David Platt says, actually contradict the gospel we claim to believe. Sit in any church, look around the pews, and have discussions, and you'll find all sorts of strange beliefs that pop up or opinions that don't jive with the gospel. And this has contributed to what I would argue a significant degradation of discipleship in the church today. But this isn't news, so I'm not going to dwell on the problems. I want to move forward a little bit into what I think are some solutions, or at least a little bit of architecture on how to move forward. And I'm going to use my own journey a little bit as a backdrop as we move forward and think about how to do this. So I'll just go with my experience. Although I was raised in the church, I grew up here in the city of Chicago. I went to Moody Church. I was 10 years old when Pastor Lutzer started preaching there. I was actually baptized by Warren Wiersbe, so I had no excuse. I had a really good upbringing and solid preaching. But like anyone else, I went off to college and did my own thing for a while. When I finally did heed the call of the Spirit of my life, I embarked on a journey of intense and independent study to try to, what I would say, made up for lost time in my own sanctification and moral and spiritual formation. I went out and I sought out the best books, the best teachers. You know, I found guys like Jerry Root that I could listen to and grow from, and that did a lot for me spiritually. But finally, I came to a point where I realized my faith was more than just an emotional disposition or an emotional state, that there needed to be what Paul talks about, the transforming of the renewing of your mind. And this was a great step forward in my own growth as a disciple. But as I studied these big questions, I realized something was missing. The Spirit was impressing upon me at that time, my mid to late 30s, that I had to start acting on what I was learning. I had to match my knowing with my doing, but I didn't know how to do that. And so he started to show me, by looking back at my own life, that I needed a guide, I needed a mentor, I needed to be discipled. So as I evaluated my own journey and I looked backwards in my own life, even back to my time in middle school at Moody Church, where I had a great youth pastor, I started kind of mentally charted the trajectory of my life, and I realized that all up until about the time I was in college, there were strong, faithful Christian men and women in my life, to include my mother and my grandmother. And they had a huge influence on me. I like to kind of call it spiritual secondhand smoke. They had a huge effect on me, and just that shows the strength of community and the communion of saints. But when I left that environment, they were gone, and no one had ever really poured into me directly on how to be discipled, how to seek that out, what to look for in a church, those sorts of things. Well, God brought me back and showed me this, and when I started to begin what I call my real foray into discipleship, he placed a real strong brother in my life. And so discipling relationships are not always going to be someone who's a mentor. Like in this case, I count Jerry as a mentor in my life. It's not always going to be someone like that, someone who's got some experience that I don't have. Sometimes it's going to be a peer. And in this case, it was a brother of mine who had spent a life dedicated to living out his faith seriously. And the more I spent with him, the more I realized I wanted a faith like him. Here's a guy that had never veered off the path, had lived his life faithfully, and I did realize I wanted to be like him. He had a serious faith, but one that translated into everyday practical life. So at my next duty station, I intentionally sought others out like him. I felt like God had given me a picture or a taste of what discipleship was like. And so I got involved at my next duty station with a bunch of Marines that were doing sort of a loose ministry of discipleship. We called it a network of Marines. And I started to hang out with guys who had the DNA of discipleship built in. Everything we did was meant to lift one another up and spur one another on to love and good works. It was a time of real intense growth for me. So I like to call it the discipleship, or the DNA of discipleship. It was in there. There was nothing special they did, but they were intentional and they were purposeful. I encountered one particularly astute brother in this time who challenged and encouraged me by continually pulling me up to a level where I wasn't. He wasn't impressed with all the learning I'd done to this time, and I found that quite refreshing, because up to that point, my own initiative was always a little bit coddled and I was rewarded for how serious I was. But in this case, he would push me to go even further and not to get complacent. So this was a really good time. Not before long, though, I discovered the C.S. Lewis Institute. And there, I told you, it's all about discipleship. There, I fell into a very formal, structured way of doing discipleship, and I understood a philosophy and ministry of discipleship of heart and mind, and how we can draw closer to God, and He will in turn draw closer to us. So I was stretched in a lot of ways, and it was more than intellectual knowledge. It grew into understanding and wisdom, and that's kind of what I want to get into next. So as I grew in this understanding and wisdom, I experienced what Greg Ogden, and I write that name down if you want to grow and learn more about discipleship. He's written Transforming Discipleship and a number of other books. I experienced what he calls the hothouse of spiritual growth. Greg would come and teach in the Institute for us, as well as my own mentor, Tom, who I quoted earlier, and they encouraged me to press to grow further in my study and in the practice of discipleship. And they led me to read other masters in discipleship, who you'll see me list a little bit. Dave Platt's one of them, Bonhoeffer, though, J. Oswald Sanders, Greg Ogden, Mike Wilkins. These guys made it more and more impressed upon me that discipleship is not just something that the church does. It encompasses everything the church does, and it's all of our callings. And that's kind of been my mission at this point moving forward, is to help people see that discipleship isn't just one thing that one set of group in the church does, it's our calling. So further, I was disabused of a couple myths, and I want to point out these myths because I think even if they're not conscious myths, they permeate the church. One is that, as Greg Ogden says, that discipleship is for an elite, more committed, more specifically trained group of Christians. That has been, I'm not going to name any names, but there are some books and teachers out there that have taught that there are tiers and that you're a convert before you're a disciple. And this kind of thinking allows us to get complacent and sit at a certain level without the constant growth. But the reality is, as Mike Wilkins says, discipleship's not one aspect of what the church does, but it encompasses all the church does. So I got upset at this point. I'm like, why did it take me nearly 40 years to learn this? Why, even despite my upbringing, why did no one ever show me that the Christian life was this rich, this textured, this full, it could be this flourishing? And my question would be for you, how is your own church experience? If you look back, have you found that sometimes your small groups are like the blind leading the blind? Or that the various components of your churches, the different ministries, are often like disparate ministries that are loosely connected by one overarching structure, and they don't ever seem to be very related? Do you sometimes feel like you're the only one in your small group that's actually taking this seriously? I mean, what's the typical small group picture? That the only person that shows up prepared all the time is a small group leader? Save one or two people? What really grabbed my attention, though, was one time when Greg Ogden was teaching, and he was talking to a group of Christians, and he asked this question. He said, how many of you here consider yourselves Christians? Every hand, of course, went up in the room. Then he said, how many of you consider yourselves disciples? About 2/3 of the hands went down because of this idea that there's a difference between being a Christian and a disciple. And the reason for this, I think, is because the word disciple has a little more bite to it. It's really hard to be a nominal disciple. We talk about nominal Christianity, right? And Christianity, being a Christian is oftentimes one more descriptor of who we are. You can say, I'm fill in your political party affiliation. I'm a Cubs fan, Sox fan, whatever. And then down on the line, that Christian happens to be one of those modifiers, rather than it being substantive to who you are. But when you say disciple, there's something about that grasps who you are and your identity. Matthew 28 is clear. It says, go therefore and make disciples. It doesn't necessarily say go and evangelize or go make Christians. Those are implicit in those commands, but sometimes we reduce it to those things. In fact, I was actually stunned when I was reading John Stott, and he pointed out that Christ's followers are called Christians only 3 times in the New Testament, and it was actually originally a derogatory term. They're little Christs. We say that in a diminutive fashion, don't we? But as Christians, what do? We take insults and derogatory comments and we wear them as badges of honor. And I think that's a great thing that we have taken this term and made it something to aspire to. But I want to go back to, and I want to hearken to a little bit something John Stott said, because I feel like in doing so, we've lost the importance of the word disciple. He said this: one wishes in some ways that the word disciple had continued in the following centuries, so that Christians were self-consciously disciples of Jesus and took seriously the responsibility to be under discipline. Like I said, a friend of mine once, the fact that the name disciple carries more weight, he told me once, it just seems to have more bite to it. When someone asks what you believe, and if you were to say, I'm a disciple of Jesus, there's a lot more weight in that response than I'm a Christian, because they've already put you in some sort of category that probably doesn't even apply to you. Okay, so that's my story and my concern for the church. We're all disciples of Jesus Christ. The notion that discipleship is only one aspect of what the church does is something that we have to deconstruct and explode. I like to think of discipleship as an umbrella under which everything else resides in the church that we do. Evangelism, apologetics, missions, humanitarian, all of these things are means of living out our discipleship. One example I like to use, and this may, Jerry, you can correct me later on, but I like to use a Lewisian analogy of cul-de-sac versus roundabouts. Sometimes we take those things we do, what I call gospel-related activity, and they become a roundabout a cul-de-sac rather than a roundabout, rather than it being a means to living out our discipleship rather than an end in and of itself. We could home and clothe every homeless person in the city of Chicago, but they could still be just as lost in the long run, right? That should be a means of and sometimes it's further down the spectrum than, sometimes you're not always going to get to a full-blown gospel presentation in some of these, but it should be a step in that direction. I like to use a bookshelf analogy. Sometimes when we think of those components to the Christian life or church activity, if we think in mental bins, think of those books as a mental bin. Think of apologetics, theology, charity, youth ministry, whatever else. Each one of those books on that shelf is one of these categories, we think. All too often, we try to make discipleship another book on the shelf. And I would contend that discipleship is the bookshelf. And all of those are ways of living out our discipleship. And I think if we have that mindset, it doesn't mean you have to change what you're doing, but it will make you more intentional, and I think it'll give you a bigger picture of what you're trying to do through the Christian life and your life of discipleship. So, in the Marine Corps, whenever we talk, we often get to the so what. You can go talk after a while, and eventually someone there, oh wait, so what? Well, so what right now? Well, here's the point. If you're like me, you want to be an earnest follower of Jesus Christ. You're trying hard. Obviously, you're here at Wheaton College, one of the finest Christian institutions in the world, trying to pursue growth in a particular area, but all of that undergirded by Christian teaching and principles, right? You're probably very involved in your church, and you in this crowd, you're very likely leaders in your church in some capacity. But you probably have, if you're not now, been exasperated at some point by nominal Christianity, the wrong focus, putting ends before means and things like that. What I want to do today is challenge you to take the initiative. I think that was the thing that was impressed upon me. I think I was sitting back and waiting for others to take me by the hand and walk me through discipleship. And I think I got complacent. And I think I got to a point where I was emotionally, spiritually, and psychologically starving for this kind of discipleship, to the point where I ran out and I sought it. And that's where I want to challenge you. I want to say this. Let me touch on something another one of my mentors, Carrie Knott, said first. I can verify, having been a Marine for 20 years, and at that time, I moved around through 14 different churches. I think since then, with some moves, I've been in about 18 different churches. I can verify how true this comment is. He says, a great deal of focus has been put on getting people in the door at church, but not enough done to help them grow to spiritual maturity once they are. Most churches are busy dealing with symptoms of discipleship deficit, but fail to treat the malady. And many pastors are consumed by programs, but I also want to give some examples where it's working. It's not just all bad stories. This discipleship ministry I talked to you about, they had this DNA of discipleship. There was no formal organization. There were no leaders. It was just a network of people getting together, gathering around the truth of God's word in mutual transparency and accountability and trust, and pushing one another to grow. If a small group of Marines, and we did this all over the globe, can do this, we can do this in our own local church or even in a student group like here at Wheaton College. My old church in Southern California, I spent a lot of time with the men's pastor there because he's a really dear friend of mine. This guy decided to forego the typical model of flashy events and large venues as a center of gravity for his mission, and they were a big church. They used to bring the Padres and the Chargers guys down there all the time for big events. But he decided to forego that, and he put his energy into one-on-one and peer-to-peer discipleship groups. And he created this thing called guerrilla groups, and after a while, groups of 3 or 4 men were joining up all over Southern California, pushing one another on into serious discipleship. So much so that at one point, he kind of worked himself out of a job because the ministry was running itself. All he had to do was go in and sign up the paperwork. So this all led to tremendous growth in his church, and I want to say by this, I don't necessarily mean quantity. We far too often use numbers as our metric, but strength should be, or growth should often be measured in strength. And sometimes, I remember, I think it was during one of the revivals, John Wesley was asked about how the revival was going in his church, if they'd seen a lot of growth. And he said something to the effect, no, I haven't seen a lot of growth, but we've seen a lot of holy subtraction. The idea is growth will not always come in numbers. Sometimes it will come in strength. And you notice that even with Jesus, many times some of those people that called themselves his followers walked away when he said hard things. So what do we need to do to move forward? What we need is a vision for this. We need to see how our various efforts fit into the grand scheme of discipleship. We need a vision to understand, our vision needs to understand that our mission is to make disciples, and we don't necessarily need to convene a meeting or have the pulpit initiate some sort of movement. We can do this at our own level, whether it's right here in the student group or your church where you notice a young lad or a young gal who needs some guidance and you invite them into a relationship with you. If we invest in the lives of a few at a time, we'll start something that will eventually grow. We don't need to be part of a program to disciple one another. We just need this vision. So this vision needs to have a couple things in it, though. Patience is the first thing. We have become, as far as measuring everything in numbers, we've also become enamored with quick and easy. We live in a fast food world where we can microwave our food and go through drive-through and have everything we want. We need patience. Disciples are made a few at a time. We also have to recognize what Greg Ogden describes so well in his book, Transforming Discipleship, that the most effective way to make disciples is through life-on-life engagement. We're not going to be able to programatize our way out of this. So we can't just come up with a 10-week or 6-week program. We need to spend time with people where they are in the mess of things. That's how Jesus did it with his 12, and that's how he had his inner circle, he had his 12 and 72, but he spent more time with his inner circle of 3 and the 12. He walked in life with them, he scolded them, he prayed with them, he loved them, he showed them how to pray. The other thing we do is we get scared. And I've learned this. I'll invite people, because we run a discipleship program, and I'll invite people who are in their 60s and 70s to be mentors, and they often say they're not prepared, even though they've been lifelong disciples. I have to disabuse them of the notion that they need to have all the answers. In fact, I almost don't like people who have all the answers, because that's all they want to do is talk and tell people answers and not even take time to listen, care for, and cry and pray with the people. We don't need to have the market cornered on spiritual maturity. We simply need to share our lives with others and commit to seeing them grow and grow with them. We have to reject shortcuts, focus on commitments, avoid expediency, and insist on relationships. In short, we have to focus on helping others conform to the image of Christ through small, quality, long-term relationships. It sounds simple, but another thing we used to say in the Marine Corps, and I remember before we went to Afghanistan, we have what we call graybeards, these old retired generals that we would pay to come back in and be consultants. And one guy reminded us, brilliance in the basics. Brilliance in the basics. Don't try to go out there and do all the high-speed, fancy stuff. You have to do the basics well. And that's what I'm just kind of highlighting right now is the basics. But I think sometimes we get enamored with programs and the latest new small group study. I won't pick on anything, but like Alpha. Alpha's been really great, really effective, and we put all our eggs in the Alpha basket. It's got to be something that comes after Alpha. There's got to be something more. Finally, these relationships, these associations, they have to reproduce. And that is where most of these discipling relationships fail. Greg Ogden points it out that we have a lot of great growth programs, but what they tend to become is holy huddles. They tend to become self-improvement programs rather than these, and we should become better. As we become more like Christ, we should become better, but we need to take that then in turn and make disciples. We should be making disciples who will in turn make disciples, because that's what disciples do. So let me go back to Mike Wilkins. Mike Wilkins says that discipleship is just not one aspect of what the church does, but it encompasses everything the church does. What did C.S. Lewis say? The whole purpose of the church is to make little Christs, right? If not, it's not worth it. So I like to think of discipleship as a continuum. Instead of falling lockstep into a single method, the one-on-one mentoring or something that maybe Crew or Navigators does on campus or that Grip Youth does really well in the city, I think it's helpful to find that whatever it is that we're doing for the purpose and the glory of first off, God's glory, but then also pointing people to Christ, it's going to fall on the spectrum somewhere. And if we see that as a means of living out our discipleship, somehow it should be pointing people to Jesus, whether it's for the first time or for the umpteenth time, which is why we have to keep preaching the gospel in church every Sunday. We have to be refreshed on that. If you see that, then all of the church's activities will start to have more of a unifying purpose. It will help us to see the big picture in all gospel-related activity, and we'll see how these are means of living out our discipleship rather than just activity. Does that make sense? One of the other proverbs I used to use in the Marine Corps was this: activity is the illusion of progress. We do things all the time, and we feel like we're accomplishing something, but all too often we're in the hamster wheel, just getting busy. And so if you read a great book by called Trellis and the Vine, they talk about sometimes if you take a real hard look at what you're doing in your churches, you actually need to stop doing some things so you have more margin to be more present and more impactful in people's lives. I think David Platt says it best here. He says, disciple making is not about a program or event, but about a relationship. As we share the gospel, we impart life. And this is the essence of making disciples, sharing the life of Christ. Whatever it is you're doing, that should be at the core. You're imparting life. You're sharing the life of Christ with others. If you're doing it through humanitarian assistance or you're doing it through teaching in a college, you're imparting the life of Christ to people. So in my final bits of call to action here as I close up, Bonhoeffer stated that the life of discipleship is obedience to the Son of God. What did Jesus say? If you love me, obey my commands. He says it's now only a question of yes or no, obedience or disobedience. If we choose the life of discipleship, quote, we must get into action and obey. So I want to exhort you this morning to cast your own vision, whether it's part of your church, here is a student group, here is part of the grad chapel. Cast your own vision and don't wait for it to come from the pulpit or someone to cast a vision or a program for you. Just look around, pray, and ask God. Robert Coleman says there are always people in your spheres of life that need you to invest in them. Pray, and they will, almost like a topographical map, they will start to pop out, and God will plop them in your lap. I did that, and I had a kid fall on my lap and lament that he had nobody to mentor him. I couldn't have set it up any better. Harvests are waiting to be reaped. It could be in your neighborhood, it could be in your church, your place of work here at Wheaton. So let's reclaim our churches from nominal Christianity, from nominal discipleship. Let's stop blaming the ills of the church on the world and pinning our hopes on politics. Let's not blame the pastors. They've got their hands full, okay? There's a lot of challenges we can't see. What we should do instead of blaming anyone else is examine ourselves and ask what we're doing and how we're fulfilling the Great Commission, because it starts with us. If we invest our lives in the lives of others, a few at a time, with the intent to multiply and reproduce, we'll make ripples that will extend beyond line of sight. You won't even know the impact you have. We can create a community of thriving, gospel-committed, Jesus-loving disciples who will fulfill the Great Commission. So let's teach this here at Wheaton College amongst ourselves, in our churches, in our families. Let's impart that to our children. Let's go back into our small groups, if you're a part of a church small group, with that intention, and share this with them. And in the end, we'll see discipleship unite us in this gospel rallying call to fulfill the Great Commission. That's all I got.